So I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes, as Vicky was suggesting, talking about life after levels. So the new curriculum, we all understand that levels are going to disappear. So I'm going to fill you in a bit about the background to that, what sort of assessments could be used instead, and what you might look for in terms of the assessments to replace levels. The last 15 minutes we'll have some questions. So kicking off with this slide, what are levels? Now you'll all know this, but I thought I'd just set it into context just to remind everybody. So currently it's the chief measurement used in the existing curriculum. As we know, the existing curriculum will finish in a couple of weeks' time effectively, and the new curriculum comes in September 14. So levels at the moment, each level has a sub-level. Each level describes the achievement that should be expected of pupils working towards that level. Level 1 is the achievement expected of 5-year-olds, and level 8 the most able pupils at 14. The expectation is that one level should be gained every 2 years, and that the majority of pupils get level 4 by the end of year 6. So as we all know, at the end of Key Stage 2 and the Key Stage 2 SATs, that's the level that's being aimed for. So the government announced about a year ago now that it was going to scrap levels as a part of the new national curriculum. And it said a number of things as to why it wanted to do that, and I've just listed a few of them here. So that quote in the first bullet point, government felt the system is complicated and difficult to understand, especially for parents. And that piece about parents is particularly important, and I'll mention parents several times during this presentation, because again, as we know, the current government has got a view that parents should be included better and be included more comprehensively in terms of the education system. So getting rid of levels was partly because the government took the view that parents don't really understand what they're all about. And government also felt that the level system encourages teachers to focus on a pupil's current level rather than considering more broadly what the pupil can actually do. So it took the view that, okay, we're bringing in a new national curriculum, so that's a good opportunity to have a rethink. That bottom point there I mentioned, parents don't understand them, and there's a consultation underway at this very minute in time. I'm sure many of you know about this already. The government's currently looking at ways in which schools might be publishing or should be publishing on their websites data in a form that's easy for parents to understand, that's all about pupil progress. That consultation is going on at the moment. We're contributing to that consultation. It will probably report in the next couple of months. But there'll be a piece then that will come out at the end of that, which will be about, okay, schools, you should demonstrate to parents that pupils are making the right progress by doing this, that, or the other on your websites. Our insight is that two things mainly. One is that it will probably appear on the front page of the school website or somewhere near the front page. And the second thing will be it will be made easy for parents to understand, so possibly in the form of narrative or other methodology like that. So government said levels are going, and there was an expectation that they might say, and it's going to be replaced with X or Y. And in actual fact, they're not going to be replaced with anything. And I put a quote there, that second bullet point. The current system of national curriculum levels and level descriptions will be removed and not replaced. From September 2014, the new national curriculum will make no mention of levels. So that's really interesting. So what government was basically saying is, levels are going, we won't replace them with anything. So great freedom for schools, you might think. However, at the same time, government through Ofsted also said, teachers will continue to track progress and provide regular information to parents. How they do so will be for them to decide. We will not prescribe a single system for ongoing assessment and reporting. Schools will be free to design their approaches to assessment to support pupil attainment and progression. So on the one hand, there's freedom, but actually on the other hand, schools will still be expected to do certain things, and those pieces there I put in bold are going to be important. Track progress, regular information to parents. Schools will be free to design their approaches, but it's got to be all about pupil attainment and progression. So freedom on the one hand, but on the other hand, schools will still need to do certain things. And this is a slide I introduced this week actually into this webinar, and many of you may have received this letter already. So on the 1st of July, so back earlier in the week, there's an announcement on the DfE website and on the Ofsted website as well that Michael Wilshaw was going to write to all schools. And this is a note for inspectors, use of assessment information during inspections in 2014-15. So what Michael Wilshaw is doing here, he's saying this is what inspectors will be looking for from September 14 in terms of the assessment methodology you might be using. So the bullet points on here are going to be particularly key and you should be looking at these in terms of what you might use as keeping Ofsted happy. So just running through them. So inspectors will spend more time looking at a range of pupils' work in order to consider what progress they are making in different areas of the curriculum. Inspectors will talk to leaders about the school's use of formative and summative assessment and how this improves teaching and raises achievement. Inspectors will evaluate how well pupils are doing against age-related expectations as set out by the school and the national curriculum, where the curriculum is being taught. Inspectors will consider how the school uses assessment information to identify pupils who are falling behind in their learning or who need additional support to reach their full potential, including the most able. And finally, inspectors will evaluate the way that school reports to parents on pupils' progress and attainment. Inspectors will assess whether reports help parents to understand how their children are doing in relation to the standards expected. And that last point refers back to what I was saying a few moments ago about the consultation going on at the moment regarding school websites and how best they can describe pupil progress in their school. So this is the first time really we've seen anything to schools that will be about this is what you'll be expected to do, this is what inspectors will be looking for. So many of you, as I say, will have received this letter already. I think it went out on the 1st of July. So just going back a step, and again, why has all this happened? And I think some historical context is quite interesting here. It's come about for a number of reasons. Firstly, the Primary Assessment and Accountability Consultation in July last year, July 2013. Government said it was undertaking a review of the primary assessment system. Now, we at GR Assessment were invited to give evidence to that, and the response was published in March this year, and the response is key because it wasn't only about levels, there were a few other things as well I'll cover in the next half an hour or so now. So the response also included, there was the formal announcement that a baseline check will be introduced in the reception stage, that's pupils at 4 or 5, to assess literacy and numeracy. The baseline check will be optional from September next year, but it will become statutory from September 16. The Assessment and Accountability Consultation also reported that there will be a focus on whether pupils will be secondary ready at 11. And the consultation also included details of new floor standards and the new scale score that will replace levels. And I'll say a bit more about that later on. But the scale score that will come in to replace levels, there's mentioned that 100, the scale score of 100, would be the expectation that pupils must reach that scale score at the end of Key Stage 2. But as I say, I'll say a little more about that shortly. Now, the other thing that was going on at the same time that was informing all of this was the NHT's Commission on Primary Assessment. And the Commission was established to support schools in determining new assessment arrangements. We were also invited to give oral evidence to the Commission. So we sat in front of the NHT panel to give our views. And the Commission published its report in February 2014. So it went some long way into feeding into the government's final consultation report. And what the NHT said, some of the key things here, all those responsible for children's learning should undertake rigorous training in formative, diagnostic and summative assessment. So that's an interesting point. That was the NHT saying, well, you might be giving schools freedom to do what they want to do in terms of the assessment regime they might implement, but also training needs to be a key part of that. NHT said pupils should be assessed against objective and agreed criteria rather than ranked alongside each other. That schools need to be clear that any use of levels in relation to the new curriculum can only be a temporary arrangement. And we've heard in the last few months that Michael Wilshaw and others have basically said, let's use 2014-15 as a transition year. So initially there was talk that from September 2014, if schools are continuing to use levels, Ofsted would take a very dim view. There's been some softening of that approach. So now the word is that 2014-15 will be a transition year. However, the letter that went out to schools, as I mentioned on the previous slides, that clearly suggests that inspectors will be looking to see how schools are moving to a new system, whatever new system that school wishes to introduce. NHT is also on record as saying schools really wouldn't want to be using levels or continuing to be using or reporting to levels from September 15, otherwise they will get a hard time from Ofsted. So there's kind of a year's grace, but clearly inspectors will be going in to see what new assessment methodologies might be being planned or actually in use. The secondary assessment and accountability consultation was going on roughly at the same time, and that reported in October 2013. And again, I just wanted to make mention of that here, because some of the things it says are useful and of interest. So it reported that on each school's website, so that's the DfE, will make sure that there is a snapshot of their performance in a standard format so parents can quickly understand the school's effectiveness. I mentioned earlier that that consultation has just begun, so that's what government's looking at the moment. This next point, that's all about parents again. Parents should receive regular information about their own child's progress. This will help parents hold schools to account for the teaching of their children and help them choose the right school for their child. We will show information about both progress and attainment in the school. Progress will be across a suite of 8 subjects. So that would be also looking at attainment across 8 subjects. And that would be about the percentage of pupils achieving a C grade or better in English and maths as well as a key focus. So we might expect to see league tables moving forward in future years being far less obsessed with 5 A stars to C's, and instead they will report on attainment across the 8 subject areas, which you could broadly say would be the EBAC subjects. There will also be a focus on the percentage of pupils achieving a grade C or better in English and maths specifically. So let's just look at some of the key features of the new system. So new assessment systems. And this is again our own take on the issue. We spend a lot of time with schools. We work closely with schools in terms of our assessment development. So we're speaking to them all the time, and we're collating feedback here about what schools might be saying moving forward. So schools will be expected to have a curriculum and assessment framework that meets the following core principles. And as I say, we've kind of collated these. So ongoing teacher-led assessment is crucial to effective teaching. So there's clearly a key place there for teachers, as there always has been and always will be. Schools should have the freedom to decide how to teach their curriculum and how to track pupils' progress. So there is freedom out there, and schools believe that, yes, they will have that freedom. But as I was saying earlier, it's great that the freedom's there, but also Ofsted will be going into your schools to be looking at certain things and certain issues in terms of how you're delivering the assessment and what that assessment tells you in the school. Both summative teacher assessment and external testing are important. Accountability must be fair and transparent. And measures of both progress and attainment are important for understanding school performance. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, future league tables will be looking at those two areas. And finally, a broad range of information about the school's performance should be available to parents and the wider public. And that's a consultation that's going on at the minute. So when we're talking to schools, they're clearly picking up all of these issues from the external environment. And these are some of the things that the schools have been saying. So just turning specifically to the reception baseline test. So as I mentioned earlier, the primary accountability consultation that reported back in March this year, that mentioned specifically for the first time that there will indeed be a new requirement for schools to assess their children at the age of 4 or 5. So a reception baseline will be used as a starting point from which to measure a school's progress. And the assessments that will be used will be seen as predictors of attainment whilst also reflecting the ages and abilities of reception children. Now what DfE government is not going to do, it's not going to create its own test. Instead what it's going to do, it's going to allow tests from a range of suppliers, which could be schools, could be commercial entities, could be others, to develop their own baseline assessments. However, those that develop baseline assessments will need to jump through a number of hoops, some assessment criteria, which the DfE has published already, and it's just refining at the moment. And that assessment criteria will be basically a series of points which will say, your test will get on the final list that schools can choose from if you meet this, that, and other requirement. And the sort of things on it, out of interest, are all tests must be trialled on a minimum of 400 children, for example. There's another requirement on there as well, which is about the test must give similar results no matter who administrates the test within the school. Because we know from our own research on baseline assessment so far, and we've done quite a bit of it in the last few months, is that there's going to be a wide range of teachers in schools who will be administering the test, ranging from teaching assistants to heads of department. So the criteria for the baseline has been established, and teachers will be able to choose from a range of assessment approaches approved by the DfE. That list, we think currently, is likely to be published around about the beginning of next year. From September 2016, the early years foundation stage profile will no longer be compulsory. So EYFS will still exist, but the profile will no longer be compulsory. And in our conversations with the DfE, when they were thinking about the baseline assessment and whether to introduce one or not, we were picking up terminology such as the DfE wanted a new assessment to be objective and not subjective. So I guess we could read into that the fact that there may have been a suggestion that the EYFS profile was to some degree subjective. So schools can still use that, but it will not be compulsory from September 2016. The baseline test, the baseline assessment, will be compulsory from September 2016. And also under consideration at this moment in time is how the results from the reception baseline will be communicated to parents and to the inspection regime. So what DfE is currently looking at too is how best can the results from the baseline assessment be reported to parents and be reported to Ofsted. And that will be they'll look at a range of areas there. So they'll look at areas that might be about how can you put in a way that's most understandable to parents and non-specialists, let's call them that, what the baseline assessment means for the parent's child. And they'll also be thinking about what does Ofsted want to see, what will Ofsted want to know in terms of the results of the baseline assessment as well. So that's currently under review at the moment. But we're developing a baseline assessment, and we shall be developing that over the course of this next year for publication in the middle of next year, ready for use from September 2015. I mentioned earlier as well that as part of the whole consultation, there was an announcement that new floor standards will be coming into play from 2016. So from that year, a new floor standard will hold schools to account both on pupils' progress and their achievements. So it won't just be about the progress they're making, it will also be about the achievement that they've actually made. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on in terms of how an assessment regime that you might want to introduce in your school can cover off both those bases. The baseline assessment will be used to assess pupils' progress from reception to age 11. So that's an interesting one. So when reception-age children are assessed at the age of 4 or 5, and the DfE has said that children will be assessed within the first 6 weeks of their entry point into reception stage. Clearly, the results of the baseline assessment will be used by Ofsted and parents to look at pupils' progress as pupils move through primary age schooling. So it really is going to act as a baseline. And an attainment standard will be devised based on primary schools equipping pupils for secondary school by the end of Key Stage 2. Now at the moment the government is working on what it's calling performance descriptors. And performance descriptors will say something about this is what progress looks like at certain stages of the primary curriculum. It's not going to be year by year. It certainly won't be by level because levels are being scrapped. Instead, it's likely to be a performance descriptor for the end of Key Stage 1 and one also at the end of Key Stage 2. And the primary school will be seen as being above the floor if pupils make sufficient progress in all of reading, writing and mathematics at Key Stage 2 from their starting point in the reception baseline. So again, you can see there that the reception baseline will be a key marker, or 85% or more of pupils meet the new expected standard at the end of Key Stage 2. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's likely to be the introduction of a new scaled score, and that will look at where pupils will be at the end of Key Stage 2. The scale score that will be introduced is likely to suggest that 100 will be the expected standard that children should reach at the end of Key Stage 2. And DfE is pinning that at the moment roughly to a level 4 being in the current system. So that just gives a flavour of the kind of level that will be expected from pupils. So how's all this gone down with schools? And we talk to a lot of schools, we work with a lot of schools. We do a lot of market research ourselves. I put this slide up there because I think it's quite interesting. And this is a survey by the British Educational Suppliers Association, which is the trade organisation we're members of, and other suppliers out there are members of as well. They did some work. They asked schools a number of questions about life after levels towards the end of last year, and the report came out several months ago. So this just puts into context really what schools are thinking out there. So 38% are extremely concerned about the removal of levels in the short term, 32% extremely concerned about it in the long term. A third of both primary and secondary schools are planning to stop using levels before September 2014, 16% after September, 30% during 2015 and 20% in 2016. So to some degree, I think that influenced DfE's thinking that, okay, we might make 24-15 sort of unofficial transition year, because clearly figures like this, and the DfE does its own research as well, but figures like this coming out from schools more than suggested that many schools weren't yet ready or weren't yet further advanced in their thinking about what might replace levels in their school after September 2014. And we do a lot of presentations about life after levels or to academy chains or formal, informal clusters, schools individually. I've done several this week actually, face-to-face, certain locations, various locations in the country. And again, when I start my presentations and ask schools, okay, who's got what in place in September, not many hands still go up. So there's plenty of schools still out there that are still wondering what to do or still working out how best they should replace levels with a new assessment regime. So if you haven't done anything yet, you are not alone. 33% believe levels aren't fit for purpose for parents. Interestingly, though, this next point, but almost half say that they are fit for purpose for teachers. So again, levels came in 20 years or so ago. They weren't that well liked at the beginning. Teachers now like them, but interestingly, teachers do think that parents don't fully understand them. And going back to what I said right at the beginning, a key influencer for government in terms of looking at fundamentally scrapping levels was they took the view that parents don't really understand what levels mean. And this last point is a very interesting one. So the survey also asked teachers, okay, well, what sort of advice and guidance might you look for in a particular area to do with this? And the key requirement came back, which was about national benchmarking. What teachers seem to be most concerned about and therefore wanted much advice and guidance and support was about, okay, I might know where my pupils are in my school, I might know where the pupils are in my classroom, but it's going to be difficult for me to know where my pupils might be on a national basis. And of course, as I said earlier, league tables are still going to exist. To some degree, we might argue they'll be even more onerous, more draconian, and therefore national benchmarking is a key area that schools are looking at or looking for assessment solutions that might suggest this is where your pupils will be on a national basis. Looking at the views of the DfE, and again, we just sort of corralled a bunch of information that we draw from various sources, and that also includes personal meetings with the DfE regarding their views about the whole life after levels issue moving forwards. So these are some of the things that we're picking up, which might give you a bit of a steer. So the first point is more about the curriculum, really, the national curriculum, because obviously schools don't have to take the national curriculum, they do have to take a curriculum that is broad and balanced. But whatever you use, what DfE is looking for is, does the curriculum provide the opportunity for all pupils to learn and make progress? So again, there's a big thing there about that word progress. Does the teaching enable pupils to acquire new knowledge and make progress according to their ability? Again, that word progress is in there. Is there a framework in place to assess pupils' work regularly and thoroughly? And is information from such assessment utilised for planned teaching so that pupils can make progress? That word progress again. Does the school provide regular reporting to parents about the progress the pupil is making? Again, that parents writ large within that. And this final, the final point there that I've introduced, and again, we put this up from a meeting with Ofsted, Ofsted HQ actually in London. And that was about the fact that Ofsted won't want to spend the majority of its time during an inspection trying to work out how effective is the school's assessment regime. So what that means is that if you've got a 3 or 4 day inspection or however long it might be, what Ofsted won't want to be doing is spending the first day or first 2 days trying to work out, okay, is the assessment system you're using, does it work? Is it reliable? Is it accurate? Is the data robust? So I think that's a key thing to bear in mind as well. If you can show us an Ofsted inspector from September 2014, the assessment regime that you're using or your assessment or your replacement for life after levels that you're using works and is easy to understand and easy for Ofsted to understand, then you can concentrate on the other areas of the inspection in your school. I'm just putting this slide up again. It's what I mentioned earlier before I move on. And as I say, this is a letter, or these are the key points from the letter that went out from Michael Wilshaw to school on the 1st of July. So just give you 10, 20 seconds or so just to look through that again, because really that encapsulates what I've been saying earlier about the kind of things that you might be wanting to look for in a life after levels, so that when the inspectors come in, you'll be ready for them. And I put there just a series of useful links. There's links to what we do on there. There's also links to the National Curriculum document, the NEHT Commission I mentioned earlier, and various other pieces of literature. So let's move on to what should you be looking for. So what should you be looking for then when you're considering a solution for life after levels? Well, we think the most important question to ask is, will this assessment provide good quality information that can be acted upon to improve teaching and learning and used to inform parents, governors and the community of children's achievements and school effectiveness? So that's the thing you should hold in your mind's eye. And the things you could be looking for might come from commercial suppliers. It might be your own assessments that you've been developing or you've introduced. It could be other schools' assessments. As many of you will know, the government ran a competition effectively earlier in the year, which they called the Assessment Innovation Fund. And that was for schools to send to the DfE their own assessment solutions. DfE went through a judging process and awarded £10,000 to 9 schools that they felt their assessment solutions were particularly appropriate for a life after levels, and that with the money the schools could propagate their solutions further across schools nationwide. So have a look at the Assessment Innovation Fund as well. And as I put there again in italics, remember that whatever you choose, national benchmarking is key. You will need to have as part of your assessment solution something which is about, okay, I'm tracking my pupils' progress in my school, I'm tracking pupil progress, one pupil against another, I'm reporting effectively to parents, but also what I'm doing is I'm looking at where my pupils are on a national basis. And what questions might you be asking of yourself, really, in terms of looking at assessments that you might feel, okay, are these going to be fit for purpose, or is what I'm looking at fit for purpose? So some of the questions you might ask yourself, what information do I need? What information do you need? What information do parents need? Because of course it's all about your local demographic. In some instances it might be about if you're part of an academic chain or a formal cluster or even an informal cluster. It might also be about a certain methodology or ideology that you have in terms of teaching and learning. So what information do you need that assessment to bring forward? How will this information be used? To some degree, government, as I mentioned earlier, will be, I suppose, telling schools how they will want to use the information. The consultation that's ongoing at the moment regarding how best you can report pupil progress on your websites. So some of it will be handed down from the centre, but there'll be other ways as well that you'll want to look to use the information, so you should consider that. You'll want to think then about what type of assessment will give you that information. And also you'll want to be considering what assessments might be the most sustainable in your particular circumstances. And again, of course, it's all going to be about the pupils that you have in your school. And this slide explains to some degree, if you're looking at what assessments might be fit for purpose, these are then some of the things that you might be wanting to consider in terms of the evidence base that you might want your assessment to be delivering. As we know from Ofsted, and as many of you will know from Ofsted, they're getting hotter and hotter about the evidential base that might lie behind the data that you have. How robust is it, and so on. So here are some of the things that, again, you might want to consider. So when you're looking at the evidence base, you'll be wanting to consider the evidence as to what skills, abilities, knowledge pupils have brought with them. That's all about baseline. Now, I know the government is going to be introducing its own baseline test, but many good schools, or all good schools, will be baselining their pupils and their students anyway. So you'll want to see where they are now. You'll want evidence to allow you to obtain an indication of potential performance at a later date. So that's all about target setting. So that's all about, okay, baseline where they are now, target setting, where could they get to? Evidence to allow you to diagnose strengths and weaknesses. So that's all about individual diagnosis and planning. Every pupil is an individual. And again, as we know, Ofsted increasingly going to schools, looking at the evidential base that you might have, which is about all pupils making progress. And we know that some schools are marked down in terms of their Ofsted inspection because they've not demonstrated in terms of the Ofsted inspectors that all pupils are making the required progress. Sometimes it's about the core of the pupils are, but different times it aren't, or whatever it might be. So it's something just to be aware of. Also, you'll want to be looking at the evidence as to what pupils are achieving during the course of the year. So that's about monitoring progress. Evidence as to what pupils have achieved at the end of a set period. That's about evaluating their progress. And the evidence of the differences between the baseline measures and the final outcome measures. And that's your value-added analysis. So that's where you can say, okay, well, this intervention did this or that, or this intervention was particularly more appropriate for this type of people than that type of people. So that's the value-added analysis that Ofsted will be looking for. And then the key one really at the end is about accurate reporting, which is easy to understand. So you want reporting that's easy for parents to understand, easy for the governing body to understand. It will be about putting data into a format that allows trends to be looked at and spotted quickly and easily. And it will also be about you demonstrating to Ofsted that we can see what we're doing on the basis of the reporting that comes from the assessment. So you can see that if the reporting suggested that this was an issue, or that was an issue, or this child needed intervention in this space, and that child needed intervention in the other space, it's the accuracy of the reporting that will allow you to demonstrate to Ofsted that you are doing things that will enable all pupils to be making progress. So let's just look at the sort of types of assessment out there. And again, these are some of the things you might want to consider when you're developing your own, or you're looking at other schools, or you're looking at materials from the Assessment Innovation Fund, or you're looking at materials from suppliers such as GL Assessment. You have criteria and reference assessment, and they measure what pupils can do against a specific set of objectives or skills. Now, in practice, they tend to be largely restricted to basic or elementary skills. So instead, norm reference or standardized assessments, and we might call those summative assessments, can be preferred, and that's the method of assessment whereby pupils' performance are compared with that of their age-related peers. And as I mentioned earlier, if schools recognise that national benchmarking is key, it's norm reference, standardised assessments that are the things that can do that. So information obtained from norm reference assessments, that information is particularly useful for comparing the performance of pupils with the national average, and that's what Ofsted will be looking for. When you're looking at tests, you want to think about, okay, well, what makes a good test? So when we're doing our own test development, these are the things that we always have in the front of our minds as our own sort of tick list. So the test needs to be objective. It has to be independent of the opinions and values or whoever's conducting the testing. It should be standardized. And that's all about looking at pupils on a national basis. It has to be reliable. So the results must be dependable, especially if you might be reporting them to parents and might be demonstrating the results to Ofsted. So for example, if you retest the pupil, will he or she get a similar score? So the test has to be reliable in that aspect. It needs to be valid, and validity of a test is the extent to which the assessment measures what it says it measures. So it does what it says it's going to do. It needs to be discriminating, so it should allow fine judgments to be made between different levels of performance in whatever is being tested. And again, if we think about moving forward, it's all about pupils making progress. That's going to be particularly important. A test will need to allow you as a teacher to demonstrate that pupils are making progress. And it also needs to be manageable. So for instance, when we develop our own tests, a significant amount of time is spent on the research and development. a significant amount of time is spent on the standardization of the test so that it's nationally benchmarked. But of course, you have to put all that into a state which is manageable for the teacher to administer, but also for the pupil to use, and of course, produce accurate results. And tests do have limitations, and so I've just listed a few of them here. So it must be a good test with the prerequisite reliability and validity, as I've mentioned. Otherwise, the results won't be of much use. You won't really get much from the results. And it's the point I made earlier about the fact that if you've got Ofsted going into your school for an inspection, you won't really want it to be spending too much time looking at the reliability and validity of your assessment. You'll really want to be having Ofsted move on to the other areas. The test score is a snapshot in time, and to a large extent, the clarity of the snapshot depends on the quality of the film, the skill of the photographer, the cooperation of the subject. So I'll move on to mentioning something more about that a little later, which is our own philosophy about how best you use tests. But it is a snapshot in time. Looking at a test score in isolation will only reveal one piece of the jigsaw, so you do need to combine your test scores with other known information about the pupil. And again, I'll say a little more about that in a few moments. And testing for testing's sake is a surefire way to end up with lots of data seeking a purpose. And as people say, and academics, others say in the UK and schools in England, that there is a lot of data out there, that Britain is data rich, but at the same time there is a recognition that we're data interpretation poor. So it's not just about the data, it's also about what does the data mean and what are you doing with the data to inform teaching and learning. So just moving on to our model of assessment, where I can bring some of those thoughts together. So we're GL Assessment. We were originally founded by the NFER, and we're the UK's largest independent provider of tests and assessment for schools. Many of you on this webinar will be using our assessments already. We're in probably about 2/3 of primary and secondaries in the UK. The tests that you might well use already range from CAT, which is our cognitive abilities test, to Progress in English and Progress in Math, and through to tests that we do for SEN pupils, such as our dyslexia screener. We also do school surveys. We have PASS, which is the pupil attitude to self in school, and surveys also from the Curtin and Rowell brand. So we do all the bits and pieces that will allow schools to assess their pupils comprehensively. We've been going 30 years, so we do have a very robust data trend behind what we do. Our materials are produced in paper and digital format. Over 7 million tests have now been taken in our online assessment system, which we call TestWise. I suppose the big difference from TestWise, when we're talking to teachers and teachers say, okay, well, you've got paper and you've got digital, what's best for me? It depends. It depends on the school. It depends on the kit that the school might have. It depends on whether the school might be part of an academy chain and the academy chain is saying, we want you to all take digital, whatever it might be. But I guess one of the key differences between taking the test on paper and digitally is that if you take the test digitally, the reports are available to the teacher moments after the test is taken. So you get that data almost straight away. And the other thing that we've done increasingly over the last few years, and partly it was because we could see that more and more stakeholders were going to get involved in having to interpret the data. They were going to get more involved in being asked by Ofsted, what does the data mean? So increasingly we've been moving towards creating reports that include more narrative and visual explanations to interpret the data to make it easier to understand, as well as producing reports for specific audiences. So in our recent tests, for example, in our updated tests, we now include parent reports, reports of senior leaders, reports of pupils. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible for schools to take the data from the assessment and present it in ways that the end audience, whether that is governing body, whether that is the senior leadership team, whether that might be parents, so that they can understand it as easily as possible. So when we're looking at our assessments, our assessment systems, this is what they do. So they track progress against expectations. They can be used to diagnose areas of weakness. They will support teacher planning. They will enable teachers to report to parents. And they'll provide key information that is important for the main transition stages. And very often that's about Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3. So using our assessments and looking at the data effectively from our assessments allows you to cover up all those bases. I'm just putting up here a little model. We call this the 4D model. And it's our philosophy really about the ideal assessment regime for a school looking for solutions for life after levels. And no one of these areas is more important than the other. But it's all about taking a whole pupil view. It's kind of a holistic approach really to assessment for the school. And it's in 4 parts. So starting on the left there, teacher judgment. And I mentioned earlier that teachers key in life after levels. So the teacher's own view of the pupil, they will know what the pupil's doing, they'll be teaching the pupil, they'll have access to previous data about the pupil. Teacher judgment is a key part of this 4D model. If you move to the bottom circle, that's about ability and potential. So I mentioned earlier about the fact that you'll be looking for baseline of pupils. Where are they now? Well, this is where they are now. So if you're looking at where they are, you can also be thinking about, okay, so this is also where they could get to. So that's sort of a starting point in a way. Moving to the top circle, that's all about attainment. So that's about monitoring progress of the pupil as he or she moves through the system. So with your ability and your potential area and your teacher judgment piece, you know where the pupil is. Looking at attainment, that means that you can be monitoring the pupil progress as they move through. And the final circle, so the one on the final part of the model, so that's the piece on the right, and that's one that we're finding is becoming increasingly important to schools, especially over the last few years, and that's about measuring the attitude of the pupil to learning and to school overall. And we're finding that increasingly that's becoming an important part of the mix. So it's not just about the knowledge the teacher might already have of the pupil, it's not just about baselining that pupil and then monitoring their progress, but it's also about what turns on and off that pupil in terms of the learning. It could be a particularly bright pupil, but actually looking at the assessments the pupil might be taking, the school might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, that pupil's not doing as well as our assessments might be suggesting that the pupil has in terms of his or her potential. So looking at the attitude is getting increasingly important. We produce material, as I mentioned earlier, called PASS, which is the Pupil Attitude Assessment in School. That's a digital survey that the pupil takes. And what that does, that looks at the results to that survey and then will classify those results into a number of certain areas. For instance, this is how well I react to my peers, this is how well I'm engaging with my teachers, etc., etc. And if you're looking at 2 or 3 areas there where you might think, okay, well, that child looks a bit disengaged in those areas, you can tap into those areas and produce some form of intervention that might unlock that child's ability better to teach, to learn, and you can build a personalized learning around that as well. So we call this 4D model, and it's about those 4 components all coming together so you get a real holistic view of the pupil. Now, the important thing about the 4D model is all about the data that comes from it. And again, I mentioned earlier about data is key, but it's about the data interpretation, because as schools we are data rich, but we are data interpretation poor. And there's different forms of data. So you can look at the comparison of the performance of the group against nationally referenced year group performance, and you can use that data to look at curriculum areas, strengths and weaknesses of the individual pupil against others. You can use formative data, and what that allows you to do is to look at starting points for intervention. It allows you to tailor the interventions, and it also allows you to measure the effectiveness of any intervention. And normative data, which we call standard age scores, they can be used to compare from one year to another to give an indication of average, but also exceptional performance, again referenced against a national sample. So many of you who use our tests already will know that our reports have contained standard age scores for a long time. And then in our life after levels, where the whole level system is being scrapped, but schools need to demonstrate progress, standard age scores are a very good way of doing that. And I'll just finish really with how we're doing that on the ground, just by using 2 tests that we're currently redeveloping at the moment and will be available for primary schools from next April. They're Progress in English and Progress in Math, and it's just really to show you how what we're doing encapsulates some of the things I've been talking about. So they will be containing standard age scores for each year, that's normative data. They will also, through the reporting, allow you to look at formative data, that you can look at some diagnostics. They will allow you to look at year-on-year progress, and therefore also allow you to identify the most appropriate interventions. And as I say at the end, they're coming out in April 2015 for primary, so that you have them at your disposal for the first year of life after levels. So that's me in 45 minutes. I hope that's been an enjoyable and informative run through in that sort of time. You can only really scratch the surface. But I hope that's gone some way to giving you a bit of a history as to why we are where we are in terms of life after levels, what the government's been thinking behind it, some solutions for moving forward, and also some hopefully helpful information about what you might be looking for from September 2014 for your solution for life after levels.